and welcome to World History Encyclopedia. My name is Kelly, and today I am joined by author and archaeologist Dean Snow. Dean is an anthropological archaeologist and an ethno-historian who has conducted field research in Mexico, the US, France, and Spain. He has served as president of the Society for American Archaeology and the American Society for Ethnohistory, as well as serving as an officer in the American Association for the Advancement of Science and 3 regional associations. Today, though, we're talking all about his new book, The Extraordinary Journey of David Ingram, an Elizabethan sailor in native North America, published by Oxford University Press. Dean, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
I'm looking forward to talking to you all about your new book. So why don't we just dive straight in and start with you telling us what your book is all about?
Well, the book's about an ordinary man who was a mariner, able-bodied seaman in the 16th century, who ended up on a voyage that took him to the Caribbean, and the ships in this little fleet of 6 ships ran into a hurricane, which forced them to put into a port on the Mexican coast of the Gulf. And they had the misfortune of arriving there just before the annual treasure fleet arrived from Seville, full of big Spanish ships and guns and soldiers and so forth. And so a terrible battle ensued, and the British ships were largely sunk, including the big flagship that the Queen had loaned to John Hawkins just for this particular voyage. And the second largest ship managed to limp out, badly damaged. A smaller ship that was captained by Francis Drake, the Francis Drake, who was a cousin of John Hawkins, managed to escape as well, but the others were all sunk. And Hawkins found himself with not just the crew of the Minion, but dozens and dozens of additional sailors that had managed to escape from the sinking ships and find refuge on this one that escaped northward. And they had gone only a few weeks from their escape, and he realized they had neither the food nor the supplies to get 200 men home. Half the 400 men in the expedition had been killed or captured already, and now at least half of the men who were with him on this ship were certainly doomed to starve or die from some other reason on the way back to England. So he gave them a choice. You want to go ashore, or do you want to and take your chances there, or do you want to stay on the ship and take your chances? And predictably, half of them decided to go ashore. And of that half, the great majority eventually were captured by the Spanish. They turned themselves in some cases, and they were captured and imprisoned in other cases. But about 24 struck out northward to try to escape. And of those, 3, including David Ingram, managed to eventually survive. And they had decided that they could walk to Florida around the northern side of the Gulf of Mexico and maybe find some help at a French colony that they knew existed in the vicinity of what is now Jacksonville, Florida, in the northeastern corner of the state. They discovered when they got close, by talking to the Indians, that they were in fact out of luck. The French colony had been destroyed by the Spanish. Everyone had been killed. And so then they had to refocus their destination, and they decided that their only option was to go to the only other place on the east coast of North America where ships from Europe would stop from time to time, and that was Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. And so they headed for Nova Scotia. And in the end, they walked well over 3,000 miles, 3,500 miles, or well over 5,000 kilometers, and were rescued on the Bay of Fundy by a French ship that took them back to France and then England. So this is the story of this ordinary man with his two friends, crew members, all three, who managed to walk through North America before any other Englishman had ever done anything but touch the shore of the East Coast. And this made them instant celebrities when they got back to London. And 12 years later, when the English got interested in colonizing, Queen Elizabeth's secretary, a guy named Walsingham, who was also her spy master, decided that they needed to interrogate these guys in order to find out what they could about where they were planning to colonize. They had no idea what to expect when they went to the area of North America that's now called Virginia. And that was the Queen's idea, by the way. So he was brought in, Ingram was brought in 1682, 1582, for an interrogation. And later, an account of that interrogation was published. But historians ever since have looked at that record and decided that Ingram was a travel liar and that he made up a lot of this stuff. And so he has been discredited and basically ignored by historians for 400 years. And I ended up telling his story in order to set the record right.
Right. Well, I mean, 400 years of bad press, you probably had your work cut out for you.
Yeah.
So in order to set the record straight, what kind of records did you have to use to do that?
Well, there were three manuscripts in the British archives that escaped destruction that were records of the interrogation. Most people have not read them because they're extremely difficult. They're written in what was called secretary hand at the time. It was a kind of writing that secretaries used exclusively because it gave them job security. Nobody else but another secretary could read this. It was almost like a code, but it was an alternate script, the kind of cursive writing, handwriting that we're accustomed to seeing, the kind we were taught in elementary school, or at least my generation was, didn't come into existence until late in that same century. And it was really because women were the letter writers in those days, and they thought that writing ought to be attractive. And this is the birth of what is really a fairly nice modern calligraphy for the writing of English. And so it was a lot of public pressure of that sort that caused the handwriting to change its style in the late 16th century. But because it was so difficult to read, most people had not looked at the original manuscripts. What they looked at instead was a publication that came out in 1589. And this was produced by a guy named Richard Hakluyt, who was the great compiler of the accomplishments of English seafarers in the 16th century. He published his magnum opus and included accounts by a whole variety of explorers that had conducted these early voyages. One of them was John Hawkins. But these were men that were educated and could write their own accounts. When it came to David Ingram, he was dealing with an illiterate, and so he had to write the account for Ingram, and he used what he had, the records of the interrogation. But because neither he nor anybody else at that interrogation really understood what Ingram was talking about, they couldn't put into context the things that they were hearing. and they couldn't make good judgments about what was real and what might not be. He also couldn't tell the difference between things that he saw in Africa and things that he saw in the Caribbean and things that he saw in North America. This was a slaving expedition, after all. And uh, when he was asked to tell his story, Ingram started at the beginning, as many storytellers will. And so he started with the African part of his long journey. And the first 18 entries into the minutes of that interrogation all reference African topics. Now, we can tell that because we know what he was seeing in Africa from other sources now. We've got a lot of information that they didn't have at the time. Hakluyt didn't have that. And what he found was that Ingram was responding to questions, and the discussion kept going in different directions. And answer to one question would prompt another question that would lead him farther astray into his memories. And the presentation lost its organization pretty early on. And so at that point, the recorders started bunching these entries by topic, and Hakluyt finished that job. So there's a section on, in his published account, there's a section on animals. So he talks about leopards and polar bears, and he talks about elephants and water buffalo, all of them, almost in the same breath. And because of that, everything gets clustered inappropriately by topic. And so we have to conclude that Hakluyt was a very good compiler, but he wasn't a very good editor. And it was because of the bad editing that poor David Ingram has been vilified for 400 years.
Right. So you've gone back to the original manuscript of
That's
the
right.
interrogation.
Right.
So do you know how to read the secretary's hand?
It was tough, but the dean of British 16th century history, or at least the exploration parts of it, was a man named David Beers Quinn, and he and I corresponded back in the 70s because he was interested in some Indian topics that I knew something about, and so we got into a correspondence. And it was around about that time he actually published a transcript of one of the three manuscripts. Then later, he published a short biography of David Ingram for the Canadian Encyclopedia of Biography. And he said at the end of that entry, there might just be something to Ingram's story that an historian ought to be taking a look at. And I remember reading that back in around 1980 and thinking, well, that's something that would be fun to take up if I ever have the time. So he died shortly after he made that prediction, but I followed up on it. And sure enough, there was something in one of those three manuscripts, and it was the 18 entries, all from Africa, that start that particular manuscript, that he spotted. I don't think he quite got it because he was not an anthropologist or a biologist, and he would not necessarily have recognized that all of those entries were just about Africa, but he saw something that tipped him off that there might be more to David Ingram that was meeting the eye at that time.
That's so
So we
cool.
followed up on that.
So was it just you following up on this idea that made you want to write the book, or was there something else that pushed you towards the story?
I didn't know if there was a book in it at first. It was one of those things you take up because it's an interesting question. And I do that once in a while. This is what people like me do. And this one came along at a time when after I realized what was going on with Ingram, I thought, well, there might be a book in this. And so I talked to my editor at Oxford University Press, who had just acquired and published a book on the American Revolution that I had done. another book that an archaeologist wouldn't be expected to write, but I turns out I did all of the field research back in the 70s for one of the battlefields in the American War of Independence. And and once again, in that case too, I ended up focusing the book on the ordinary people that were involved. The generals usually get all the top billing, and all the talk is about, well, their decision making and whether they did the right thing and so on and so forth. And nobody finds out much about the average soldiers. But that information was all there in a widely scattered set of journals and diaries and short accounts that had been written after the war was over. And I thought, okay, that's a good idea. So I wrote a book length manuscript on that, which is done well at Oxford. And so my editor thought, well, maybe we've got another crack at it with this David Ingram thing. So he encouraged me. It took more effort than any other book I've written, simply because I kept thinking I had to write it like an archaeologist, and that would have been self-defeating. I needed guidance from people who knew how to write a book for the general public. The average reader is not interested in all the detailed description of how you got to a particular conclusion. They just want to know what you think. But you have to be able to sort of reverse engineer it. If somebody says, "Well, how do you know that?" Well, you have to be able to explain yourself. And so we have an online companion website that allows people to get into the more detailed stuff if that's what they really want to follow up on. Well, and some of the stuff that he talks about is just it is even today kind of hard to believe in some cases. I mean, he describes manatees, and these are animals that literally weigh a ton. And I'm talking to you now from my condominium in Florida, and these animals swim around just outside our window. But they're immense animals, and he described it, and he described it in some detail and very accurately. He picked up on the fact that all those little silver hairs are used by the animal to navigate. They can detect currents in the water with these little hairs they have growing. They're hairs with nerves in them, believe it or not. So it was things like that. It turns out this guy was illiterate, but he was a natural historian. He had an understanding for the natural life and for people as well. He was sort of a natural ethnographer. He really enjoyed interacting with the Africans and the Native Americans that he encountered, and they enjoyed him. He got along very well. He did not encounter much hostility on his way along his 3,500-mile walk in North America.
It's incredible. He sounds like a fascinating person. What's the most interesting or surprising or fascinating thing that you found when you were sort of researching David Ingram and this book?
Well, I suppose that would have to be his encounter with northern Iroquoian people in what is now southern Pennsylvania. I live most of the year in Pennsylvania, so I know that state, and I did a lot of research on northern Iroquoians back in the 80s. I had a big project, archaeological project that went on for years, and so I know the Iroquoian stuff pretty well, but I wasn't expecting to find that David Ingram had found the most interesting village that he visited on this long trek to be one of the northern Iroquoian villages in southern Pennsylvania. And so the discovery that he had been to one of these villages was really a surprise to me at the time. And when I looked at the words that he remembered these people uttering 12 years earlier, one of them is clearly a northern Iroquoian word, and his descriptions of the houses are accurate from northern Iroquois. So it's, a convergence of the archaeology that I know quite a bit about and an account that I wasn't expecting to include a description of any of that. He then continued, well, he spent more than a week in that village. It was the longest that he stopped anywhere. And he saw things culturally that they were doing that later became famous. These people became famous for these particular features, masking, curing ceremonies, and that sort of thing. So there was a lot of feedback to my earlier work that I unexpectedly encountered. And then he continued on his long walk and went through New England and up to the Bay of Fundy.
Wow, that's very cool. So probably final question, is there something, or what is one thing that you want everybody to know about either David Ingram or your book in general?
I suppose the thing that I want them to get from it is that ordinary people have lives too. And frequently there are ordinary people that have extraordinary lives. And we're not lucky enough to know much about many of them, simply because they don't get recorded, especially in a century like the one that he lived in, where all the sailors were anonymous. There were 15,000 sailors involved in the battle between the Spanish Armada and the English ships in the English Channel. 15,000 of them. And almost none of them have names. We know them. The rosters don't survive. We know the captains and we know the senior gentlemen that were running the show, but we don't know anything about all of these people who were deeply involved in what was going on out there and losing their lives. And we see that even today. Of course, we watch the news, and it's the ordinary people that get involved in extraordinary events that are sort of briefly, because we've got such good communication now, famous, but their fame doesn't last long. And they're almost invisible in a time like the 16th century. So I thought he really deserved to have his reputation rescued. And he really had an extraordinary life. And he probably was one of those 15,000 sailors that were in the fleet that went against the Armada. And then he ties in with a lot of other stuff that went on in that era. So that was why I thought he deserved a second look.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Dean. It's been a pleasure talking to you. If anyone's interested in the book, The Extraordinary Journey of David Ingram, you'll be able to find the link to purchase it down below from Oxford University Press.
Thank you very much for having me.
This video was brought to you by World History Encyclopedia. For more great articles and interactive content, head to our website via the link below. If you like my shirt, you can find this design and a bunch more in our shop at worldhistory.store, or you can find a link for it down below. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you soon with another video.